In the world of wealth and power, not everything is as perfect as it appears. Behind the polished facades of grand mansions and luxurious lifestyles often lie secrets so dark they can shatter the lives of everyone involved. For Charles Whitaker, a millionaire businessman, and his beautiful yet cruel wife Vanessa, their seemingly perfect marriage was nothing but a ticking time bomb. As years of emotional abuse wore down Charles's spirit, he found himself seeking solace in the arms of someone unexpected, a young, ambitious secretary named Claire Roberts. What started as a seemingly innocent affair quickly spiraled into a web of manipulation and deceit. Claire, determined to secure a future of wealth and power, began to plant seeds in Charles's mind, suggesting that the only way to escape Vanessa's grip was to remove her entirely. In a moment of desperation, Charles fell victim to Claire's twisted plot, and together they devised a plan to murder Vanessa. But what Claire didn't foresee was the true nature of her betrayal. As the night of the crime unfolded, the lines between victim and perpetrator became blurred. Claire thought she had won. She had helped Charles kill his wife, after all. But what she failed to realize was that in the dark, tangled game of ambition and desire, she would become the next victim, paying the price for her own wicked plans. Vanessa Whitaker was the epitome of beauty and grace on the outside, but beneath her polished exterior lay a woman consumed by control and an unrelenting desire for power. Born into a wealthy family, Vanessa had always known privilege. Raised in the lap of luxury, she was taught from an early age that appearances were everything and that the world revolved around her. Her upbringing, marked by indulgence and entitlement, shaped her into a woman who demanded nothing less than perfection in every aspect of her life. At first glance, her marriage to Charles Whitaker seemed like a perfect match, a union of two successful, attractive individuals. Charles, a successful businessman, was deeply in love with Vanessa when they first met. He admired her beauty, her intelligence, and her poise, believing that together they could build an empire. But soon the charm that had drawn him in began to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of Vanessa's personality. Vanessa's controlling nature seeped into every part of their marriage. She was an expert at playing the role of the loving wife in public, but in private, she was cold, demanding, and belittling. She often criticized Charles for not being successful enough, for not being attentive enough, for not being everything she thought he should be. The emotional abuse she inflicted on him was subtle, yet constant. Charles, though wealthy and influential in his own right, began to feel like a shell of the man he once was. His self-esteem eroded under Vanessa's caustic remarks, and his spirit was slowly suffocated by the weight of her expectations. As the years passed, Vanessa grew more entitled and distant. Her obsession with wealth and status only deepened, and she became less interested in nurturing her marriage. Instead, she focused on outward appearances, on maintaining the perfect public image of a powerful couple, while quietly eroding the emotional foundation of their relationship. She was always scheming, whether it was investing in lavish trips or controlling Charles's business dealings to serve her own needs. Yet despite the emotional toll it took on him, Charles had nowhere to turn. He had become isolated, unable to speak out against the woman who had once captivated him. Vanessa had carefully crafted the illusion of a perfect marriage, ensuring that anyone who looked in from the outside would believe they had it all, while she silently destroyed her husband from within. Her beauty, wealth, and control over her husband had earned her a reputation as a woman who had everything. But it was this very power that would ultimately lead to her undoing. Vanessa's obsession with maintaining her dominance in the marriage, coupled with her complete disregard for her husband's emotional needs, paved the way for a betrayal more horrific than she could have ever imagined. Little did she know that the man she had oppressed and manipulated for so long would finally break free, and in doing so would seal her tragic fate. Claire Roberts was a young woman with ambition burning in her veins. Raised in foster care, she knew from an early age that life wasn't going to hand her anything. If she wanted something, she would have to take it. Having never known the comfort of a stable family or wealth, Claire was driven by a desire for security, power, and status. She had spent most of her life learning how to navigate the world using her charm, intelligence, and cunning. becoming an expert at reading people and exploiting their weaknesses. Claire was intelligent, but she didn't come from money, and she knew that her looks alone weren't enough to propel her into the world she craved. She wanted more than just a modest life. She wanted the luxury, the comfort, the respect that came with being part of the elite. So she learned how to manipulate situations, how to seduce, how to use people as stepping stones to get what she wanted. Her job as Charles Whitaker's secretary gave her a taste of the life she aspired to. At first, Claire's attraction to Charles was simple admiration. He was powerful, successful, and wealthy. But as their professional relationship deepened, she began to see him not just as her boss, but as an opportunity, a means to an end. Claire, with her bright eyes and seductive charm, began to catch Charles's attention. She listened to him when he confided in her about his unhappy marriage. Unlike Vanessa, Claire was kind, attentive, and understanding. She made Charles feel heard in a way his wife had long since stopped doing. For Claire, it wasn't just about the affair. It was about control, taking someone who seemed unreachable and breaking them down, molding them into the partner she needed to achieve her goals. As Charles grew more disillusioned with his marriage, Claire saw her chance. The more he confided in her, the more she could work on him, twisting his emotions and manipulating his sense of self-worth. She made him feel like he deserved more, like he could have a better life, a life with her. But Claire wasn't just after an affair. She had a much darker plan in mind. She wanted everything. She wanted Charles's wealth, his status, and the life of luxury she believed she deserved. In her eyes, Vanessa was a barrier to that. Vanessa's cruel treatment of Charles was only an excuse to Claire, a way to justify what she knew had to be done. Vanessa, in her mind, was an obstacle that needed to be removed in order for Claire to secure her place in Charles's life and in his fortune. Claire had no moral compass when it came to achieving her desires. The emotional manipulations were just the beginning. Once she had Charles convinced that Vanessa was the root of all his problems, she pushed him to take the next step, a step that would forever alter the course of their lives. Together, they devised a plan to murder Vanessa, making it look like a random act of violence, a robbery gone wrong. Claire, the mastermind behind it all, was careful, calculated, and determined to make sure that nothing would stand in her way. But what Claire didn't realize was that, in her ruthless pursuit of wealth and control, she had set into motion a chain of events that would soon spiral out of her control. She thought she could manipulate Charles into doing her bidding, but as the investigation unfolded, Claire's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The woman who had once held all the power was now trapped in the very web of deceit she had spun. Claire Roberts was a woman driven by ambition, willing to sacrifice anything, including her own morality, in the pursuit of a life she thought she deserved. But in the end, her quest for power and luxury would cost her more than she could ever have imagined. It was a quiet night in the Whitaker mansion, the kind of evening where the world seemed to slow down and the silence felt almost suffocating. Charles and Vanessa had attended a small social gathering earlier in the evening, a charity event where Charles had put on his usual mask of a successful, doting husband, while Vanessa floated through the crowd, her icy demeanor making everyone around her uncomfortable. It had been a tense evening, with the couple barely exchanging more than a few words. Back at the mansion, Charles was exhausted, emotionally drained from yet another interaction where Vanessa had belittled him in front of others. But Claire, his secretary and confidant, had a way of easing his pain. She had been in touch with him throughout the evening, offering her support and kind words when his wife's cruel behavior had worn him down. By the time Charles returned home, he was desperate for an escape, and Claire knew exactly how to give it to him. Claire had planted the idea in Charles's mind for weeks, subtly suggesting that the only way to free himself from Vanessa's grip was to take drastic action. Over time, the idea had begun to take hold. Charles had grown to trust Claire more than he trusted anyone, including his own wife. The once naive businessman had become convinced that his only path to happiness was to remove the one person standing in the way: Vanessa. That night, as Charles sat in the study, the weight of Claire's words heavy in his mind, Claire arrived at the mansion under the pretense of needing to drop off some papers for him. When she walked into the study, there was no hesitation, No second thoughts in her mind. This was the moment they had been building towards. Claire calmly approached Charles, who was sitting at his desk, his back turned to her. "We can't keep living like this," Claire whispered. "You need to act now, or you'll regret it forever." Charles turned to face her, his face a mix of anguish and resolve. "What if I can't go through with it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You don't have a choice anymore," Claire replied coolly, her voice smooth as silk. "This is the only way. I'll be with you every step of the way." At that moment, it all became clear. Charles's mind was made up, clouded by desperation and manipulated emotions. He had been convinced that killing Vanessa was the only option, and Claire had expertly guided him to that conclusion. Together, they crafted their plan. The murder would look like a botched robbery, a random act of violence. Vanessa, who often stayed late in her room, working on various social engagements, would be an easy target. Charles had access to all of the mansion's security codes and knew exactly how to disable the alarm system. Claire, ever meticulous in her planning, had already ensured that Vanessa's bedroom window would be left unlocked, making it appear as if an intruder had gained access through the house's back entrance. The night was cold and the moon hung low in the sky as Claire quietly slipped into the mansion's back door. Charles, his heart pounding, waited in the study. He knew that once this was done, his life would never be the same. But he also knew that he couldn't keep living under Vanessa's cruel thumb. The moment they had been waiting for came when Claire let herself into the house and silently made her way upstairs. She was calm, eerily so, her steps soundless on the hardwood floors. Charles watched through the security cameras on his phone, confirming that everything was in place. Vanessa, ever the creature of habit, was in her bedroom, organizing papers. Claire crept up behind her and, with a swift and practiced motion, struck her across the head with a blunt object, an antique vase from the living room. The blow was so hard that Vanessa didn't have time to scream. Her body crumpled to the floor. But Claire wasn't done. With a cold, calculated expression, she ensured Vanessa's life was taken. Charles, hearing the faint sounds of the struggle, gripped the edge of his desk, his breath shallow. He wanted to be there, to be part of it all, but Claire assured him that this was necessary for everything to go smoothly. Once Vanessa lay lifeless, Claire quickly staged the scene to resemble a robbery gone wrong. She rifled through the drawers, overturned furniture, and scattered a few valuable items around to make it look like an intruder had broken in. But it wasn't enough to just kill Vanessa. Claire knew that in order to protect themselves, they needed a plausible explanation. They needed to make sure the police wouldn't suspect them. After ensuring the scene was convincing, Claire left the room just as quietly as she had entered, her heart racing with excitement. She walked down the stairs, her mind already moving on to the next steps, making sure Charles stayed calm, acting like the distraught husband who had discovered the crime. When Charles entered the room moments later, he feigned horror and disbelief. He knelt beside his wife's body, calling 911 with a shaking hand. "My wife, she's been murdered," he cried, his voice choked with emotion. The police arrived within minutes, and Claire, playing her role to perfection, was the concerned friend who had come to check on her boss. She acted distraught, offering sympathy while ensuring her alibi was flawless. But in the aftermath of the crime, Claire's plan didn't go as smoothly as she had hoped. As the investigation into Vanessa's murder unfolded, inconsistencies began to emerge. The perfect crime they had plotted together was starting to unravel, and the pieces of the puzzle Claire had so carefully arranged were beginning to fall into place. The discovery of Vanessa Whitaker's body rocked the quiet, affluent neighborhood. Police were called to the scene, and within hours detectives had arrived at the Whitaker mansion, where Charles and Claire were already being questioned separately. Vanessa's death was initially treated as a robbery gone wrong, a standard response when a wealthy individual was found dead under suspicious circumstances. The scene was convincing: overturned furniture, drawers rifled through, and valuables seemingly taken. But Detective Sarah Hayes, a seasoned investigator known for her keen eye for details, wasn't easily fooled. From the moment she stepped into the Whitaker mansion, Detective Hayes knew there was something off about the crime scene. The house, opulent and immaculate, seemed too perfect. The place was too clean, too controlled, And the timing of the discovery, just hours after Charles and Claire had returned from a charity event, struck her as oddly convenient. Detective Hayes started with Charles. He was the husband, the one who had discovered his wife's body. On the surface, his reactions seemed genuine. Shock, grief, and confusion. But Hayes had been doing this long enough to recognize the subtle clues people give away when they're lying. His story about the events leading up to the murder seemed rehearsed, too polished. His description of finding Vanessa's body felt detached, as if he was describing something he had already imagined in his head, rather than something he had actually witnessed. "Mr. Whitaker," Hayes began, her tone calm yet firm, "can you walk me through exactly what happened when you discovered your wife's body?" Charles recounted his discovery in a strained voice, but his narrative was full of small gaps. He seemed unsure about certain details, particularly how he had managed to find his wife's body so quickly after returning home. I, I just knew something was wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "I went upstairs and the door was ajar. That's when I found her." Detective Hayes noted the inconsistency in his statement. The door was supposed to be locked. Vanessa was a woman who valued her privacy. It didn't add up, but she pushed forward knowing that these inconsistencies were only the beginning. As she listened, she could hear the tremor of guilt in his voice, though he tried to hide it. Next, Hayes spoke with Claire. As Charles's secretary, she was naturally concerned, even offering assistance in any way she could. Her role in the case seemed innocent, but Hayes wasn't convinced. Claire, a young woman with ambition clearly written all over her, was eager to help. Too eager. She told the same story as Charles, an account of arriving at the mansion, finding the police already there, and offering her support. But Hayes wasn't buying it. There was something about Claire's poised demeanor that didn't match the expected chaos of someone reacting to a violent crime. "Claire, I need you to be completely honest with me," Hayes said, studying the secretary's every movement. "Where were you when Charles found his wife?" Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting toward Charles before she quickly turned her gaze back to the detective. "I was at home, just like I said," she replied. "I got a call from Charles and he told me what happened. I came as soon as I could." The timing of Claire's arrival was another red flag. She had been in constant contact with Charles earlier in the evening, yet she had arrived at the mansion, suspiciously, soon after the body was discovered. Claire's response seemed rehearsed, too careful. It didn't take long for Detective Hayes to piece together that Claire had likely been in the mansion before Charles had even called the police. The detective's suspicion grew when she examined the crime scene in more detail. The initial signs of a robbery were present, but there were no signs of forced entry. The back door, which was supposed to be open for the robber to enter, had no sign of being tampered with. The security cameras, which should have captured the crime, were conveniently malfunctioning. Everything about the crime scene seemed staged, as if someone had intentionally orchestrated it to look like a random act of violence. The breakthrough came when Detective Hayes reviewed the security footage from the mansion's outside cameras. While the footage was grainy, one thing became clear. The timing of the footage didn't line up with Charles's story. The cameras showed Claire entering the house through the back door earlier in the evening, long before Charles had returned home and discovered Vanessa's body. This small but crucial detail turned the investigation on its head. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Detective Hayes obtained search warrants for both Charles and Claire's phones and personal computers. What she found only deepened the mystery. Text messages between Charles and Claire revealed a far more intimate connection than they had let on during their questioning. The messages were filled with romantic exchanges, but more disturbing were the exchanges detailing the plan to murder Vanessa. In one particularly chilling text, Claire had written, "Once she's gone, everything will be yours. We'll be together, and no one will stand in our way. Just remember, we have to make it look like an accident. No one can know we were involved." This text was the smoking gun that tied Claire to the crime. It wasn't just an affair. This was premeditated murder. The detectives dug deeper into the financials of the Whitaker family and found something even more disturbing: Vanessa's life insurance policy. The policy was structured in a way that Charles would receive a substantial payout if Vanessa were to die under accidental circumstances. It was clear that the financial motive, coupled with Claire's ambition and their growing relationship, had created the perfect storm for murder. As the investigation unfolded, Claire's role in the crime became undeniable. She had not only been involved in orchestrating Vanessa's death, but had also helped to stage the scene, ensuring the robbery gone wrong narrative was convincing. Charles, once a victim of his wife's cruel behavior, had been manipulated into carrying out the murder. But Claire had been the mastermind, the one who had driven the plan from start to finish. The detectives now had enough evidence to move forward with an arrest. The crime, which had once seemed like a random act of violence, was now unfolding as a carefully planned conspiracy. The web of lies, deceit, and manipulation that Claire had woven began to unravel, and the truth, ugly and chilling, was emerging in full force. The trial of Charles Whitaker and Claire Turner was a media sensation. The wealthy businessman and his secretary-turned-murder accomplice were accused of orchestrating the brutal murder of Vanessa Whitaker, Charles's wife, in a plot driven by greed, betrayal, and a forbidden affair. The courtroom was filled with reporters, photographers, and spectators, all eager to witness the downfall of a powerful man and the woman who had played a crucial role in his wife's death. The prosecution had a compelling case. The evidence against Charles and Claire was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, text messages, and forensic evidence all pointed to the pair's involvement in Vanessa's murder. Claire's text messages, in which she detailed the murder plan, were read aloud to the court, sending shivers through the room. The prosecution painted Claire as the mastermind, a young, ambitious woman who had seduced Charles and manipulated him into committing the unthinkable. Charles, on the other hand, was portrayed as a weak man who had fallen prey to Claire's manipulations, too blinded by his desire for freedom and wealth to see the consequences of his actions. The opening statement from the prosecutor was direct and blunt. This was not a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated murder executed by two people who thought they could get away with it. They thought they were smarter than the law, but the truth is clear. They took a woman's life for money, for power, and for their own selfish desires. Charles sat quietly, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. His defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Gregory Hall, argued that Charles had been manipulated by Claire. Hall portrayed Charles as a broken man who had been a victim of his wife's cruel behavior for years. He claimed that Charles had not intended to murder his wife, but had been coerced into the crime by Claire, who had seduced him and used his vulnerability to control him. Charles Whitaker is a man who, for too long, lived under the thumb of his wife's cruelty, Hall said in his opening remarks. He was manipulated, made to believe that this was the only way to free himself. Yes, he was complicit, but he was not the mastermind. The real villain in this case is Claire Turner. The defense tried to paint Claire as the true criminal, an opportunist who had seduced Charles, manipulated him, and ultimately pushed him to murder his wife. They argued that Claire had meticulously planned the crime, using Charles as a pawn to achieve her own goals. But while they tried to shift the blame entirely onto her, the jury remained skeptical. Claire's role in the crime was far too prominent for the defense to convince anyone that she had been solely responsible. As the trial progressed, Claire's testimony became the focal point of the proceedings. Sitting in the witness stand, she appeared composed, even calm, as she recounted the events leading up to Vanessa's death. But her words only served to incriminate her further. She described how she and Charles had planned the murder together, how she had helped him disable the security system, and how she had staged the crime scene to make it look like a botched robbery. "I loved Charles," Claire said, her voice smooth and calculated. "We were in love, and Vanessa stood in the way of our happiness. I never meant for it to go this far, but when she kept pushing him, I knew something had to be done. I wanted us to be free." Her admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. She spoke with a chilling sense of entitlement, as if the murder was a mere means to an end, a way to secure a future with Charles. But there was no remorse in her eyes, no signs of guilt. She appeared detached, almost indifferent to the life she had taken. When it was Charles's turn to take the stand, he was a different man. The once confident businessman was now broken, a shell of the man he had been before the murder. He admitted to being involved in Vanessa's death, but he insisted that Claire had been the one who masterminded the entire plot. His testimony painted Claire as the true villain, a woman who had manipulated him, used his weaknesses, and convinced him that killing his wife was the only way to escape her cruelty. "I never wanted to hurt Vanessa," Charles said, his voice shaking. "I just wanted to be free. Claire promised me that everything would be better. She said we could have a life together, a fresh start. But I was wrong. I should have never listened to her." The prosecution, however, tore into Charles's testimony. They pointed out that Charles had been an active participant in the murder. He had not only agreed to kill his wife, but had played a pivotal role in carrying out the crime. The evidence against him was clear. He had access to the mansion's security system. He had been in communication with Claire throughout the evening, and he had been the one to disable the cameras, ensuring that the crime would go undetected. "You may have been manipulated, Mr. Whitaker," the prosecutor said, "but you still made the choice to kill your wife. You still played a part in her murder, and you will be held accountable for it." As the trial entered its final stages, the jury deliberated long and hard. They had to consider the motivations behind the crime, the roles of both Charles and Claire, and the evidence that had been presented. In the end, they reached a verdict that was both expected and shocking. Charles Whitaker was found guilty of second-degree murder, though his sentence was lighter than many had anticipated. The jury found that while he had been manipulated by Claire, he was still responsible for the death of his wife. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Claire Turner, on the other hand, was convicted of first-degree murder. Her role in planning and executing the murder, as well as her lack of remorse, sealed her fate. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel struck, the courtroom fell silent. Charles's face remained stoic, while Claire, for the first time, showed a flicker of emotion, a cold, calculating smile. She had gotten what she wanted. Charles was out of her life, and she would serve her time in prison. But there was no escaping the consequences of their actions. Both would spend the rest of their lives paying for the life they had taken. The trial of Charles Whitaker and Claire Turner ended in convictions that reflected the gravity of their actions, a chilling reminder of how deception and manipulation could destroy lives. While Charles's sentence was somewhat lenient, the long-term consequences of his involvement in Vanessa's murder would haunt him for the rest of his days. He had been a man consumed by greed and weakness, but in the end it was his own choices, however manipulated, that led to his downfall. He would spend the next 25 years behind bars, a life stripped of the wealth and power he once knew, but never truly enjoyed. Claire Turner's fate, however, was far grimmer. Her calculated actions, her cold manipulation, and her utter lack of remorse made her a danger to society. Convicted of first-degree murder, she was sentenced to life in prison, her ambition and desire for a life with Charles now reduced to nothing more than a memory of a tragic, destructive obsession. As for the Whitaker family, the fallout of the crime left deep, irreversible scars. Vanessa Whitaker's tragic death served as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked desires and the consequences of betrayal. Her family, once torn apart by her death, could only mourn the loss of a woman whose life was stolen for nothing more than ambition and greed.